think we are having yet another reception tonight at 6:30, 6:45 upstairs outside the office after the lecture. So hopefully you will join us again tonight. So welcome back. This is our second lecture in our fall series. And tonight we're very happy to be able to welcome Marcelyn Gow back to UIC, partner and founding member of Servo Los Angeles. Marcelyn received her architecture degree from the AA in London, a master's in advanced
MSADD from Columbia, as well as a doctorate from the SCI-Arc, where her dissertation was entitled Invisible Environment, Art, Architecture, and a Systems Aesthetic, 1960 to 1971. While at Columbia, Marcelyn met the three other partners that would first found Servo, and their collaborative practice initially emanated from 4 different cities in 3 countries, an early application of the network model to forms of practice, not simply to forms of architecture. Schooled at that moment in the mid to late 90s of the first generation of paperless studios taught by people like Greg Lynn, who left us here Thursday night. Servo came of age with that generation's digital experimentation, reflected under the theoretical sway of Sanford Quinter. In particular, his interest in rearranging previously distinct domains of nature and culture, or what Quinter would call the biosphere and mechanosphere. This ambition continues in Servo's work, which often situates itself at the edge between mathematics and materials, where the challenge of trying to describe and control forces and energies that are resistant to such efforts. So we count Marcelyn as a fellow traveler and inspiring instigator to what we refer to here as an interest in perverse precision. Marcelyn teaches at SCI-Arc, has previously taught at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, UCLA, ETH, and has published in Perspective, BIA, AD, among other venues. Servo's work has been exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Pompidou Center, Archilab, Artist Space, the Mac Center, Storefront for Art and Architecture, and SF MoMA, where it is also in the permanent collection, as well as being the permanent collection of the FRAC. A monograph on the firm's work, Networks and Environments, was published in 2008, executed in collaboration with Servo Stockholm, the office directed by Ulrika Carlson. The installation Aquiotrope was exhibited this spring at SCI-Arc and is just opened, I think, at Archilab. The project, a reconsideration of the green roof, which certainly needs to be reconsidered. Aquiotrope aims at creating a fully 3D immersive environment, not merely a surface applique of green. So we hope that Marcelyn will get some commissions here in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming back Marcelyn Gow.
Thank you. Great introduction. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I was here, this was 2010, for the ACSA conference that we put together, which was a fantastic experience. So tonight I am, the title of this lecture is called Tropes, or Another Fine Mess. Another Fine Mess actually is the title of a book that just came out that I'm co-editor of. It's a book of SCI-Arc student work, so plug for my school here. It's available in my office. I just gave him a copy. The idea, I was new at editing this. I did it together with Ming Fong and Florencia Pita. My idea was to look at something I saw as a kind of tendency where there's a shift away from it. In my education, there was an obsession with geometry, the precision of geometry, and how that was sort of translated with advanced digital technologies, and there were many years of discussions about that. And so I decided, I was looking at a lot of the work that's been going on lately in many places, not just where I teach, but in the work that we're doing in our own office, and thinking about this notion of the fine mess. It's a nod to Laura Hardy, Stan and Oliver, another fine mess you've got me into, the kind of oxymoron between something that would be a mess and something that is actually finely controlled. So I think that resonates with what Bob termed perverse precision. Yes. So I'm curious later we can talk about that. That sounds fascinating. So the trope, is a literary or rhetorical device, for example, a metaphor, metonymy, synagogue, that uses words in ways that are used in other ways than their literal sense. And so, a few of the tropes that I'm talking about here. The first one is called objection overruled. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the text that I wrote for this volume, Another Fine Mess. Beginning with the short quote, Yves Allenbois, talking about Marcel Duchamp's three standard stoppages. Once submitted to gravity, once lowered into the contingent world of things and bodies, sign does not hold water. It dissolves as an iterable sign and regresses toward singularity. So, on to my text. Within a discipline where the exact translation of virtual instructions in the form of drawings or codes to their material actualization has historically played a decisive role, the current use of algorithmic design tools and computer numerically controlled fabrication technologies would seem to all but eliminate the possibility for exactitude to submit to some external corrupting influence. Paradoxically, the seduction of algorithmic precision has become partially exhausted in the fulfilled promise of its own fidelity. The absolute control of geometry and its materialization suppresses the potentiality of that which exceeds the fermentas of inert matter. This exhaustion gives way to a particular strain of contemporary design practice, obsessed with capturing qualities that lie outside the realm of computational control and would appear to be incongruous to the processes and tools used to generate them. Pursuing the apparent and actual vagaries of matter in flux, albeit through the use of highly controlled algorithmic and machinery processes. In some instances, this incongruous state is engendered through contamination, whereby the precision of a process of delineation begins to reveal internal discrepancies germane to the process itself, or the particularities of geometry become compromised through its translation from the digital to the analog realm. Rather than an adherence to the lawful inscription of information, as some proponents of a parametric approach to design would advocate, this sensibility embraces that which disturbs identity and challenges our engagements with matter. Liquefaction of the eye, liquefaction of the sky, and liquefaction of words. Evershay's viscous declensions of the term eye in his liquid words paintings and Georges Bataille's The Story of the Eye both subject matter to radical transmutations, but the spill that captures Rocher's eye is an accurately rendered spill, the contours of which are marked by the precise meaning of pigment and its receptive surface. Unlike the actual play of gravitational forces that directed viscous matter in its contact with the dirt hillside in Robert Smithson's Louis IV, this fabricated spill involves virtuosity in the control of a specific medium towards the production of an illusion rather than a completely unbridled flow of matter. The image conjures an imaginary inverse process, not the drying out of words that have just been written, but the melting of the letters, their more or less slow fusion towards a state of indifferentiation. Likewise, the objects in Bataille's story, chosen for their orbicular morphologies, are endowed with diverse material properties, allowing the eye to migrate through a series of objects having various consistencies ranging from luminous to liquefied, from the gelatinous quality of a soft-boiled egg to the creamy iridescence of a saucer of milk. The eye figure remains intact with surfaces in various guises. In the universe Bataille constructs, these conjunctions between figure and materiality breed strains of fuzzy eye-like avatars that, despite their apparent misalignment, emerge as utterly plausible due to the craft exercising coalescing physical properties of matter with things. Liquefaction, both in the painted words of Rocher and Bataille's story, produces a state of indifferentiation that disrupts and tends toward the obliteration of discrete identities. As a process, it involves a shift from the precisely figured toward a more entropic state, approaching the abject. These are Roxy King's spume text. The abject, literally a derivative of the Latin to cast off or to jettison, was described by Julia Kristeva in her text Powers of Horror as the reaction to the loss of the distinction between the self and that which is other. So an image from a visual studies seminar that I teach at SCI-Arc to the student group. The oxymoron, another fine mess, points to the apparent irreconcilability of the two terms, how can mess, defined alternately as a concoction, jumble, medley, a state of confusion or muddle, or a dirty or untidy state of things, constitute something fine or exquisite? Moreover, the oxymoron becomes compounded when it is applied to architecture, where the job of the architect has conventionally been that of giving geometric order to a state of disorder. The drawings and objects presented here address this apparent irreconcilability. They share a predilection to disturb identity, system, and order through presenting a challenge to establish orders, positions, or rules, yet they operate in a refined manner within the very systems they attempt to interrogate. So this is the guy who said the job of the architect is giving geometric order to a state of disorder. Kisho Kurokawa, metabolist architect, his project Metabony from 1969, which was a proposal for a floating city that would house fisheries and petrochemical industry off the coast of Tokyo. What's striking here is the obsession with things that are the sort of hardware-software dichotomy, and the idea that information technology obviously is kind of transmitting something that is more ephemeral or evanescent, that's hard to grasp or image. So at the time, a lot of the architects who were dealing with this, among them also Archigram, looking at some of these issues, attempted to use the circuitry, the hardware itself, as the kind of model of organization. So the imaging of that urban environment was literally defaulting to the hardware that would channel that evanescent matter. At exactly the same time, this is a year later, 1970, the BAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, Pepsi Cola Pavilion, which was constructed at the Osaka Expo in 1970. Collaboration of 30 artists and engineers, Fujiko Nakaya, the Japanese artist who designed this cloud, the artificial cloud. Later, she was asked to consult Dillard's video on the Bloor building, where they used kind of the same technology 30 years later, 40 years later. And the idea here was that the solidity of the architecture, the building would obliterate its own identity by emitting this kind of artificial stratus cloud. And there were, objects that were designed to traverse the plaza outside of the building, so it was all about a kind of interactive experience where these objects were moving with motors. When you approach them, they would kind of back off and swerve into a different direction. So the idea was also about engaging flows and circulation of people in this space, and how architecture could begin to do that. Again, I sort of have an obsession with this period of like 69, 70, all these things happened. 66, but it was shown in 72, Super Studios Passephora lamp, which also kind of questioned the sort of role of the product itself, that the lamp is something that would be a tabletop object that could also occupy the floor, that has a kind of eccentric grounding condition, which, and also can accumulate in clusters, forming what they call part of a microenvironment. And so one more reference before I get to our work, that these are just things that I think are relevant to the discussion that I'm putting on the table tonight. But Wen Ying Tsai, an artist, also designing these cybernetic sculptures, which were oscillating rods that they would project a stroboscopic light onto the rods to change the way in which you perceive the object was no longer inert. It was all about kind of fluctuating, sort of standing wave that would fluctuate visually in space due to the input. So a lot of the work that we've done at Servo, and I'll start with one old project, just to kind of make the point of transition of some musicians to our work. But a lot of it has dealt with that issue that Bob said in the introduction, that the network as a model of how things get channeled through a space, and whether those networks are more visible in terms of their hardware or more ephemeral. So something here again about the issue of the geometry as a paradigm. I mean, something we were looking at that time was the registration, very exact reproduction of a basic geometric unit, to form this network. We called it an archipelago. Lattice archaeologics is the piece. And the idea that there would be, again, this more evanescent relationship with the light that gets triggered as one moves through the space. So kind of drawing light through the space via a series of proximity sensors that would communicate with relays and trigger the LED lighting in the piece. So again, these kind of diagrams show the literal kind of hardware and its connectivity that quite literally the geometry is braiding itself through space, and it's touching, it's tangent, it's forming a series of these clusters and islands. Again, this is the prototype, the stereolithography prototype, and then there were a series of casts made of that. We've continued to, most of our work, we've worked with this casting issue quite a bit, but in this case, it was a vacuum casting to obtain like really high fidelity of geometry, but then also hoping to kind of obscure the clarity of those contours and that geometry through the light that is being pushed through the object. And so these are some diagrams just showing, again, much like the passiflora lamp that we were looking at as a precedent, how we could create a kind of obstacle in the space. This was at in Graz at the Late Utopias exhibition. And the idea was that you had to move in this kind of corridor space between the other adjacent exhibition galleries, and so we would sort of create this obstacle that people would then have to engage with by moving through it, and they would start to experience transformations in the light levels based on their movements. And this is just a diagram of some of that communication between sensors and relay parts that communicate with these cells. Some diagrams of that, just looking at the staging of that. So the physical connectivity versus something that is more immaterial in nature, and kind of the design was really intended to, when left in a kind of inert state, to resample the patterns of light movement that had been produced by the movement of people in that space. So then moving on, again, the issue of things that are more evanescent, we started to look at vegetation as something that could be, rather than light, or, well, the next project I'll show is going to be sound, but I'll just read a quote here. Grass above, glass around was Rainer Bannon's believed characterization in a 1977 article of the same name of the binary aesthetic he observed in Norman Foster's building for the Willis Faber and Dumas headquarters in Ipswich. The inscrutability of the building, discussed by Bannon in the context of both aesthetics and performance, owes in part to the apparent energy wastefulness of curtain wall construction of the time, juxtaposed with the presence of growing turf on the roof of the building. So the kind of odd, we saw this kind of incongruity between the sort of high-tech curtain wall system and the green roof, which eventually we would understand like that. Turf on top, and this is a quote from Bannon, turf on top of a high-technology building full of air conditioning, escalators, computers and stuff, once again separated expectations. Different architectural languages have been shotgun married without apology or regard for the niceties of academic discourse, where turf is perfectly acceptable as long as it is on small windowed, irregularly, technologically low-profile buildings like this one. So the vernacular sod roof construction, where the vegetation in itself starts to challenge what Bannon would refer to as the detailed decoration and incident of the building type. That even the legibility of the windows, the fenestration becomes overwhelmed by this. The difference between the wall and the roof starts to be eradicated here, and the features of the architecture become obliterated by this unruly cultural matter. So, again, more discussions of entropy. Robert Smithson's partially buried woodshed, and again, the same year, 1969, that Kisho Kurokawa is writing about the job of the architect giving order to geometric disorder. In this case, showing the kind of structural failure as a consequence of loading a structure to the point of collapse. And this kind of discussion of the entropic possibilities of things that challenge the sort of cleanliness, stasis, firmitas of what we normally consider, our job as architects to uphold, is something that comes into play in some of the other work that we've done. So this project was designed for a show called Gene Home, curated by Aaron Schreiber and Ron Neumann at the MAC. Actually, Sean Lally was also in the show, and his piece was right where we're sitting, vis-a-vis this, right outside the nursery. The idea behind that show was to look, one of the aspects of that show was to look at how certain digital technologies were reconfiguring the domestic environment. And the space that we got assigned was the nursery. So we started to think about a couple things. Again, this idea of a network, of something that is like literally physically connected. A lot of the work we do is also reconfigurable, so it's kind of pneumatic in a sense. It can be installed, like the Lattice Archaeologics was installed in several different exhibitions in several different configurations. And in this case as well, as you can see, the idea is it's a modular system. In this case, there are like 3 modules that plug in to form units. So there's a little bit more variation, continuing the research from the Lattice Archaeologics on how we can generate variation with things that are identical. So the house, again, this sort of small window wall attaching to that, because the house is an historic landmark, is not allowed to attach anything permanently with fixtures, nails. So we used suction and began to think about this as a kind of artificial synthetic vine in a sense. And you can see in the background the lush garden that the house sits in, and the way in which it was designed by Schindler to engage with the garden to enable vegetation to kind of encroach in the upper sleeping porches. So there is a kind of really embedded relationship there that we started to kind of mimic in a very synthetic way and say, okay, this is a complete artifice. But there is a sense of growth and a sort of responsiveness to the external conditions, because as you see the sunlight hitting this, the way this worked is that each of the cells contained a small microcontroller, a speaker for emitting sound, and a photo sensor, which was sensitive to changes in light levels. So as the sun moved around the house, it would begin to stimulate the production of sound out of each of these cells. So this, as I mentioned, was, here were some diagrams of the kind of modular system that could clip together in different ways, looking for, again, variation, but with a set of basic parts. And just a diagram of the sort of explode bag, so the hardware. Again, the issue of the hardware and software, that quite literally each of these had its own small microcontroller, so it was more of a distributed intelligence rather than the Lattice Archaeologics, which was coming from the central computer. So there was a combination of both wired connectivity and wireless with RFID cards, so these units could communicate with their neighbors, all kind of chattering according to a series of algorithms where there was like a 30-centimeter zone of contact, so one gets sort of stimulated, communicates to the neighboring one, they emit a sound, that sound pattern then is altered depending on how many of these pieces start to engage in that sort of form of chatter. And so, again, you can see another view of this in the house. The idea was that there is sound, but it's, again, I think this is just reloading in here. I don't know if this is even audible. Some of the sounds that were produced. But the idea was also that the people who were moving inside of the house around this would also change the sound patterns that were emitted by their inclusion of light. So in a sense, it was referred to by Blaine John, who was at the conference, the opening, as a series of kind of digital lullabies that are produced. So trope 2, objection sustained. This is a project for a green roof. It's in Stockholm, on the outskirts of Stockholm in an area called Albano. And the idea was that it is meant to house the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is a group that is going to move onto this campus in the future, and had asked for sort of ideas about how they could engage the public with a greater awareness of what they call resilience, or what might be called also sustainable technology, sustainable issues. So what we did was we designed this vast green roof that would actually, so over here, that this is this whole part of campus that they're developing, former brownfield site with railway lines. And the idea was to create, we collaborated with an ecologist who had studied the area and the different kind of local biotopes that they would create what they call stepping stones for some of these various organisms, plants, animals in the region. And so that these are the kind of master plan that they gave us, which are going to be a combination of offices and student residences and dorms. And this would be a huge lecture hall and some offices for the Stockholm Resilience Center. And the idea here was really that the roof could begin to channel water. We looked at the precedent of the Namib desert beetle, which is a small beetle that has a kind of bumpy back, where the material properties of its shell are kind of in sync with the morphological properties. So there are hydrophobic and hydrophilic areas, so areas that repel water and areas that attract water. And there are these kind of bumpy points. Later at MIT, researchers began to simulate this with glass that's embedded in glass pellets embedded in a wax substrate to try to look at how they could create water catchment systems. So this is purely speculative proposal, but the idea was that the roof would also hold down on a large scale, like instead of being a kind of conventional flat green roof that we only see from above and rarely experience in a kind of more immersive way, that in this case, because the roof is actually literally pulling down to make some of these internal subdivisions, you would have access to that. So it would become more pedagogical in nature, and there are also areas where you could access the roof from above and walk on it. So these are some of the apertures from the interior looking out where you can start to see the roof. This is a contour plan just showing the different depressions and valleys. The idea would be that some of these areas would have quite thick substrates for a kind of semi-intensive green roof, as it's called, as opposed to the extensive. And that water would literally be collected, forming kind of fen conditions and marsh conditions on the roof. These are just some sections through how the roof actually, in a sense, it's just really a sign of a roof that bifurcates open, potentially to form a lecture hall. This is a model of it. Again, the protuberances, the idea sort of inspired by the Namib desert beetle, where the tips of those, the idea was they would be made with recycled glass, and there would be different degrees of porosity in the glass so that water could be attracted to the tips and then drained down to the lower depressions in the roof. And so these are just some diagrams of those protuberances, as we call them, and just some sections that show ideas about how the substrate thickness would start to engage with the curvature, the convex and concave, that would form different kind of local conditions, local microclimates, where various types of vegetation can be grown. So you have dry systems, meadow systems, and more wet vegetation. Again, these are spec'd by an ecologist who specializes in green roof technology, so a lot of the local vegetation was specifically chosen to thrive in ways that also might, begin to challenge the legibility. Again, you have the geometry here, so we draw it as architects. These are just some views of how the different scenarios of vegetation might change. So the idea that this is really, that there's no fixed way of anticipating how that roofscape or how that building will look, but that one engages with the idea that there is a certain degree of uncertainty being produced. So trope 3 is called minutia. And there, I love words, so I sometimes have to read because they're just, but this is actually, so this is a quote, minutia, it's also something I'm writing about for a book. Ellen Manfredine is doing a book about some of the recent, well, not recent, but last 10 years, thesis projects at SCI-Arc. And my contribution is called Minutia. I was looking at this great text by Jorge Luis Borges, Funes de Memorias, which is from his book Labyrinths. He's talking about this character, Funes, who has a kind of photographic memory and remembers every single detail of everything he sees, and so he can only sort of rest his mind from kind of redrawing everything he has seen when he thinks about something that is kind of blank, and he describes it as that there's a part of the town that is being built, and he has never seen the houses that are being built there, so he has to imagine them as dark, full of dark, homogeneous blackness in order to stop the process of drawing. So the quote from Borges, "He was, let us not forget, almost incapable of ideas of a general platonic sort. Not only was it difficult for him to comprehend that the generic symbol dog embraces so many unlike individuals of diverse size and form, it bothered him that the dog at 314, seen from the side, should have the same name as the dog at 315, seen from the front." Very architectural. I suspect, however, that he was not very capable of thought. To think is to forget differences, generalize, make abstractions. In the teeming world of Funes, there were only details, almost immediate in their presence. So the idea of the sort of minutiae that allow us to, distinguish between one form or another is also an issue that we started to look at in this project, which was an exhibition designed for a show called More Than Sound at the Bonniers Kunsthall in Stockholm. This was an early kind of schematic rendering of something that we were looking at in terms of a very simple graphic procedure where we were taking images and live tracing them in Illustrator to get a kind of vector of the border between contrasts. So it didn't really matter at the end of the day what the image was. It produced this kind of graffiti-esque line work with a lot of cusps. And we were seeing is the same line but with different stroke weights, the one on the right, the black one, a very heavy stroke, to the point at which the weight of the line begins to obliterate its legibility and almost kind of, it gets so thick that it just becomes a surface, as opposed to the left, where we still see the intricacies of the line work. So it was something we were invited to, as a show curated by Sarah Arrhenius and Theodor Ringborg. It had people like Scanner, Harun Mirza, Carl Mika van Halswolf, a lot of electronic musicians, contemporary, also sound artists who would not call themselves musicians, so that was kind of an interesting distinction. But the idea was that because their work was all based on sound, they wanted something very subtle to create a continuity in the exhibition space for people as they moved through. So we started to look at this idea of this, the graphic, the stroke weight, the offset of it, the extrusion again, looking at the passiflora, the idea of taking some of those lines, beginning to extrude. So you can see here they had large spaces that, our interventions could only be quite small in these areas, almost like small scribble lines that would then be used to create the continuity between the flow of people through the space. And so again, looking at this issue of cusps and things like very small distinctions where the line, where the curvature changes and how those get perceived. Initially, we had also wanted to project the graphic line back onto these. Curators are pretty strict, so we were only allowed to use in white. But there were some odd moments in terms of the way in which that geometry became inscrutable based on the subtlety of the cusp versus the space it was in, the lighting that happened to be in that space at that given time. So again, these are just small interventions that begin to look at how the legibility of those extruded lines changes as you move through the space, and how this was looking into their cafe area from the lobby. This is one of these views. So again, it was an exhibition designed as a sort of backdrop for the sound artists. So then we continue to look at that issue of the cusp and the resolution of the cusp. And this is a project we're just working on right now for a small 400 square meter lecture hall in Stockholm at the Royal Institute of Technology for the engineering school. This is a roof. Again, we're primarily designing a roofscape for them. Seen from above, again, taking the sort of both the logics of extrusion and subtraction together in this project, looking at things like Mansart's Hotel de Ville in Arles, where the stereotomy, it's kind of here, but the stereotomy in this system of walls is pretty spectacular in terms of how the grain of the stone coursing is changing according to the larger cuts and how that becomes registered through the stereotomy. And so taking that idea and starting to look at that in terms of what would happen if we started to do that with things like wood grain. So this is just a small model where we're looking at how the subtraction of those figures from something that is grain will start to reveal different kind of patterns within the mass. So these are just, this is a kind of contours of the roof geometry. In the center, the idea to have a skylight, skylight area, and then these kind of smaller subtractions that begin to undermine the kind of larger cuts in the form. And then again, taking some of those figures onto a smaller scale for vertical circulation, small internal space and lecture hall. This is an image of the rendering very schematic, and we're just starting this, so let's hope it goes forward, but who knows. But the idea, again, that the roof, in this case, like the hydrophile, pulls down to the ground and becomes something that really starts to, again, produce a sort of obstacle to circulation. It is the roof really sits like an object in that courtyard. So the last trope is raising. And this is the project that we did for the SCI-Arc gallery last spring that Bob mentioned, where we took some of these ideas about the roofscapes, and we started to think about how that could translate into a series of roof tiles. So it's a very different outcome than what we had expected. But I would like to, let's see, just talk a little bit as a precursor to that, again, returning to this issue between this sort of precision, geometric precision, and its corruption that I brought up at the beginning of the talk. Linda Beglis piece from, this is also 1969. It seems like everything I'm looking at happened that year. Quartered meteor, which is a kind of slump cast that is, of course, looks very inexact and is produced to some extent by inexact processes. Also this one called blatt, which is literally paint that is poured and to drawing in these layers. So here we have a kind of coupling of the thing looks inexact and the process is somewhat inexact. And you know, the discussion, obviously, Roxy Payne's work, SCI-Arc, the degree of exactitude here is increased exponentially. I mean, there's a kind of paint deposition device that can be controlled, but the outcome nonetheless looks pretty inexact. And something, you know, that I've been thinking about a lot is the shift from, like, in 1993 when Greg Lynn wrote probable geometries, and a lot of his texts where he was really discussing the difference between anexact geometry and inexact, which for him at that time was off the table because it's too unwieldy. Architects can't really translate. It can't be kind of captured and codified and reproduced. So therefore, the inexact, which was something that Yves Lenoir and Rosalind Krauss were discussing in terms of some artistic practices, was something that really was outside of the realm of the architect's control. But the anexact was really where it was at. That was sort of the desirable. And so we see here that the embryologic house diagrams, you know, again, the ideas of parameters that control and regulate the kind of family of forms. You know, Mario Carpo has talked a lot about this in terms of a kind of post-digital sensibility where we almost return to a kind of pre-printing press way of understanding similitude, because we start to sort of recognize algorithms. So we can look at the schematics and say they all belong to the same family, even though if you started to do measured drawings of them, their qualities are quite different. And again, just showing you one of these pieces from the seminars that I've been doing where we're casting things like resin into rubber molds that are made, flexible rubber molds, so you get a degree of exactitude. I mean, again, these are all produced in a really simple digital way using something like the height field tool in Rhino, which is just a kind of bump mapping of an image. But the idea is that it sort of provokes the question. We've been looking also at how to draw these things, how to animate them, because, you know, the idea of iterative contours, which made so much sense with projects like FOA's Yokohama, for instance, where, you know, you could actually start to describe a complex surface through those iterative sections. When something becomes so differentiated and messy in a sense, the form, even though it's digitally it's very precise, but then what would be the role of those kind of contour drawings? So these are a lot of issues that are just sort of on the table at the moment in both my teaching and in our work. And this is the poster from the show called Aquia. And something we looked at, the reason it's called Gray, and there's a fantastic book by Aris Fiaretis, who is a writer, it's called The Gray Book. He's looking at the difference between literary criticism, which is what he was trained in and what he conventionally wrote, and more narrative forms of literature proper. And so he takes this sort of trope of gray literature, which are things like reports, bibliographies, dissertation material, things that are not kind of regulated by a conventional publisher, but nonetheless they're referred to as gray literature in terms of a library cataloging system. And so the idea of graying in his book was really about a shift. That book was at the moment where he, as someone who was born in Greece, raised in Sweden, and wrote in English, so already the language, you know, his notion, he's interviewed me, often talks about the mother tongue being so kind of elusive and in a sense corrupted because there are all these different languages that he's dealing in, made us think a little bit about, well, how would we situate that whole discussion of geometry today? I mean, because a lot of the sort of formal logics of some of the contemporary work that's going on tend to call into question that whole thing of the precise or even the inexact form. And so I would just like to read a short piece from his Gray Book. Our grainy void does that. It allows us to perceive and experience an aperture opening orifice toward other worlds where nebulae may appear as small as fissura, molecules as unfathomable as parallel universes. It keeps us, that is, in the gray, If we wish to tell stories in this mode, we must stick to the contour, because security is only found there. Form precedes fact, as matter cannot be emptied of form, whereas the latter may easily manage without the former. So the idea that the contour or the geometry getting distributed in a number of objects in a space and producing a kind of diverse series of reading of that geometry. So in some cases it becoming quite inscrutable was sort of the idea behind this project. I'd also like to thank the Graham Foundation, who I don't know if Sarah's here, I was thinking she could be here too. Oh, great. Who very generously supported this exhibition. So it's great to be able to show you the outcome of this. And so, you know, as I said, we were invited to exhibit in the SCI-Arc gallery, which is conventionally people do. There are a couple different approaches. I mean, usually there's a full-scale installation. Often it's a piece of a kind of prototype, a structural prototype for a building. And we started to think initially about building part of one of our roof projects, either the lecture hall roof or the hydrophile. And then we thought it's kind of absurd to build this roof, and also in terms of budgetary constraints, to build a whole roof inside of a gallery. So what we decided to do was to develop the idea of the roof tiles, of these protuberances, of these pieces that would have different degrees of porosity. We did some of these in ceramic, which tended to be a more difficult material to work with in terms of the firing. So in the end, the ones that were shown in the exhibition are actually concrete. But again, you can see here this idea of the precision of the geometry. I mean, these are all starting with very precise forms that we can see here in these kind of clusters. Again, the idea being that these things are all reconfigurable. It's a modular system. There is, in fact, only one geometric primitive, a kind of teardrop shape that is used to make everything that is in the exhibition. And so the idea was, you know, what happens to this stuff, the kind of precision and purity of that geometry, when it gets translated through a series of phase transitions. So you mill it in foam, you then make silicone molds of it, you then make jacket molds of those, you then cast into that. The jacket molds have a flexible inner layer, so the whole idea of casting in silicone would enable the space of the mold to be used. You could shape it in different ways during the casting process, exert pressure on it with the fiberglass jacket that's bolted onto the exterior, and also different admixtures of cement, and the ceramic ones were also produced in the silicone jackets as well. So looking at these different degrees of porosity, which were desired, we were trying to get areas where water would start to collect in, you know, forming these in these porous areas of the tiles. And you can see there's some water on there, and the way in which these would start to cluster. So each of these is intended to be, you know, quite large-scale roof tiles. So in the end, you'd have this kind of very bumpy gray roof where vegetation would start to take hold, root systems in the porous areas as well, and water would be channeled down to the low areas of the tiles. But again, you know, being inside of the gallery, we decided to sort of simulate the roof by saying, okay, these large tiles, which are like 3 feet in diameter, are situated on the gallery floor, and taking the idea of creating another sort of immersive space, making a series of lighting fixtures that use the exact same geometry, totally modular. Everything in the show is modular, although it really tends to defy that, which is what we were interested in. You know, again, so we see the drawing of this is positive aggregation, like Boolean addition, Boolean subtraction, same exact primitive, but here they're cutting away at each other, and these produce the geometry for the lighting fixture. So in that case, again, a translation, you know, milling them out of foam, and then these are plaster negatives, and then you blow glass into the plaster. Again, the mold becomes a kind of transactional space. You can see thereafter glowing. The degree to which the geometry is registered in the glass depends on how much it's blown, if it's overblown slightly or underblown. And then we also played with the orientation of them to create openings for the light fixture itself in different positions. So these are just some shots of that. So the idea was that everything in the show was all kind of generated from one single form, but produces a much higher degree of variation than in some of the earlier projects we were looking at. The drawing itself also becomes part of the provocation on this discussion between the translation of geometry and the kind of material corruption. So you can see the drawing on the back wall there, which was a kind of vinyl drawing. And then looking at looking at the idea of the wiring of these, again, the idea that you have 21 lighting fixtures that all need to be supplied with electricity, and how rather than just coming up with a kind of very neat and tidy reductive scenario, we started to look at things like cable spaghetti that you often get with a lot of computer equipment, or diagrams that were ranging from Keisha Kurokawa, this one from 65, metamorphosis, other diagrams of a sort of network, much looser, kind of scribbly line work. This image from Stan Allen's book, Computer Film Diagram, Albert Olin, Computer Paintings, where there's a kind of digital and analog mix informing this network and the way in which these lines are positioned in space to be more or less legible. So then here on the wall, we have the drawing, which also was a play. It's not really an architectural drawing in the sense that it's not a section. The line weight definitions are not done according to an architectural convention. It's basically an output from the digital file that based on what things were cut, you get a heavier line weight. And so we just kept that as a way of creating a different legibility for that drawing. So it's not sort of outlined according to the way one would normally do a section. And so then some of the images of what we call the cable sargassum, looking at the way that sargassum seaweed is sort of suspended on the surface of the ocean and kind of dangles downward. So creating this almost implication that we have this third layer in the gallery, canopy, formed by all of the wiring to supply the lighting fixtures. And that part of the exhibition, there's always a workshop that runs in tandem with the installations that occur in the gallery. So some of the SCI-Arc students who participated in the workshop, we actually actively engaged them in the design of that network. So that was a kind of process that went on throughout the installation to form that overhead kit. And so these are some of the images from opening. And I'm just going to play it. And for some reason it's there, but so this is a video which isn't showing. Interesting. Maybe it's showing on screen. Anyone know why it would play here and not? Let me just try to bring up the different. Brian, the student who made this film, was using one of the small robot, maybe what we call it, to do these camera shots of the piece. So he had the film camera attached to the robot and brought it into the gallery. So it was something he just wanted to do as a project. The thing I thought was funny about seeing this is how people now engage in an exhibition space with their cell phones. Some people recognize technology as inspiration. Yeah, over the course of the exhibition, people use this sit on this after lunch. I mean, it was kind of fascinating to see the way that people interacted. So again, the idea of these group files sort of shifted into an installation. Sorry about the sound. It's very low. So with that, I'd like to close. Happy to take questions. Okay.
Could you just talk a little bit more about the desire to move from inexact to exact, like what's the stake, what are the gains involved?
Well, I think that part of it, I mean, some of the kind of tools that we're using to both design and to fabricate have shifted. I mean, some of this is also stuff that you see with like coding and scripting things that, as opposed to, when I went to grad school, it was all about fantastically precise and virtuosic models using the software like Maya or something, and you could sort of see when it was right and you could see when it wasn't. We talked about clean geometry, messy geometry was bad. But I think that there are, even just looking like at the rocks you paint, the idea that you would have a procedure, and a lot of the students that I are with the robotics lab have been looking at stuff like this, where you have, some of my young students were doing wax deposition, like paraffin wax into vats of water, where you can follow a very precise script, as it were, tool path, but because the materials have a different kind of fidelity, so the wax is going to behave erratically when it hits the water, you will get deviations. So very much like the schematic. I mean, it's taking that as a precedent, saying how can we start to look at that, and what might that do to the role of the drawing as something that anticipates. The drawing is done first, and then the things that we produce from it should match as precisely as possible. What happens if there's a kind of engagement, that's what we're looking at, like with casting, inside of the mold, for instance, where something is intended to happen that will produce a different outcome from what is drawn or can be drawn. And I guess that, I mean, I see there's, maybe a kind of aesthetic fallout of that, where things that would appear to be, less, that would appear to be messy, maybe would suddenly start to be considered as sort of proper forms. I don't know if that's clear.
I guess maybe you're just drawing with messier pens.
In a sense, yeah, in a sense.
I mean, the material, it's a little bit like the Boucher drawing of I spelled out zero. I mean, in a way, they're still drawings that are generated by a robot. I mean, there's different methods of,
But then,
and another material that is not, has different tolerance than.
yes. But then the role of the, then it's more important, that toolpath is more important than to describe what you're going to get. At the end of the day, you'd hand over the toolpath instead of handing over the delineation of the schematic. So that, I think, is interesting in terms of the discussion. Well, if we look at Mario Cargo and his whole discussion about rarity and the role of, where we understand similitude, there's a certain agreement, and geometry plays a very strong role in that. And I guess if you're getting these sort of slightly variant outcomes from something that is nonetheless very exact, how could that start to enter the architectural discussion, and how could that change the way the role of clean geometry? I think that's where, I find it provocative. I don't know exactly what the fallout will be, but we've had a lot of these discussions because of the robot, which at first people said, well, it's just a more capable, just like a CNC milling machine is also a robot. You feed it the toolpath, but you do an exquisite model and it executes the exquisite model for you. I think some of the more interesting work that's starting to be done is where people are looking at how that process of translation reveals its own discrepancies in a sense. And then that might produce a series of forms that we would have maybe in 1993 said that those were, inexact, bad, ugly, unclean, but suddenly become sort of understood as having value because they tie back to this logic of perfection.
Part of what you're saying, some thoughts on the relation between targeted and range, whereas in some cases, one of your path distribution drawings, you talk about the role of obstruction, and I'm thinking, and there was a drawing that tries to analyze the impact of traffic around the obstruction objects, which were say. That's one way of thinking about targets and bigger paintbrushes, suddenly clean spaces that are carved out, which raise my, we're also trying to do surfaces in a way that we pull down the roof to create more obstructions. Not really, I guess, observation that I find really fascinating because you're now trying to measure impacts of social spaces or urban spaces.
Which maybe ties back to the Kurokawa, the mentality where literally you have a circuit or becomes, in his work, becomes a political.
Maybe continue with that analogy. How important is it to see or to acknowledge the network? Because maybe in the arch logo and that, even in the last project, there's a form, like when it's an object, the object seems to exist in a node. So you can read an object, and you can therefore, in a way, read the network through the object. And even the last one, the network, I guess, can be seen through the electricity that runs the wiring is the object. Now when you start getting projects that have surfaces, like projects and stuff, because is the network
last project in the installation, the idea, again, this shift toward a series of objects that are all kind of related. I mean, it goes back to that thing of the code, that there is this drawing that's driving them, but then at a certain moment, it becomes, you become uncertain of exactly, they're really deviating from that drawing. So they're starting to become semi-autonomous as opposed to operating a network. And then there, like you said, the cable becomes this sort of overt network, which is basically the space. So that was kind of a shift looking at how the different objects could start to unpack or unfold aspects of, like, where is the DNA of that, where is that drawing in a sense. It becomes distributed through the series of things that are in that space.
Yeah, I was trying to figure if it had to do with the, as I know you went into the case study, where we start seeing the stonework and the curvature of the larger groups. We're able to start to get patterning, but it's actually construction. I wasn't sure if, now as you start talking about vegetation being added onto it and the tile, what those in a sense become the way in which the network manifestation and the idea of ornament or tracing, those ones become one and the same as the surface. Where before they were just disparate object network. Now on the surface, does that become, you don't no longer have construction lines or like Greg's billboard index leading to a mark, but is it actually some form of the network itself that becomes the, again, I don't say ornament or trace or what have you, but
Well, it starts to shift the other part to whole legibility of, because that's what we were doing with that like messy model of the wood. Thinking about, okay, this is still a model, but that could there be a way of working with woodland so that you could then start to, by excavating parts of the laminated wood and laminating it in sort of ways that were differential, not always in the same direction, that you could create other seams, other parts of whole suggestions of how that wouldn't really be so much about the formal logic, but it would be a different set of geometries that get kind of embedded into the material.
yeah, well,
And
before
get
it
excavated.
was an assembly of parts, that give you additional rows and applied condition on top of that. And when you're talking about the water and vegetation, we have a network that seemed to be a resultant aesthetic that came out from assembly, not from an applied condition, but it came from the network condition of water and plants.
I have a question. So some of the earlier installations and the earlier group kind of seem to have a different sensibility than the later projects. So the earlier ones are kind of more spindly with aggressive angles, and the later ones are more bulbous and kind of soft. I was wondering if that corresponded to the shift in your interest in geometry and the way to use, or the way that it interacts with people these systems that kind of evoke a different sensibility, I guess.
Good question. Yeah, I think with both the roof project for the lecture hall in Stockholm, this attractive carving project, and the Inquitrim installation, because we were looking more at kind of volumes that begin to either be, again, only in the logic of addition or subtraction, as opposed to the higher fiber, which is more of a surface that gets pulled or extruded to form these kind of points. So they're all like part of the same. There's a certain smoothness, and these were really looking at seams and at kind of strong contours that are produced. So that's with the idea of the RSP Erectus text, that what happens, where does the contour exist, and at what point does it also start to get obliterated? Each of the tiles was treated, as I said, treated differently, and then there was a different degree of pigmentation in them, some of them being very, very black, others being a kind of light gray. And with the lighting fixtures, the way that the glass, whether you use white glass or clear glass, it will change the legibility of the geometry. But in those, it's really about looking at kind of volumes being produced.
I mean, you're calling them tiles, and I guess the question is what constitutes an architectural tile? I mean, I'm thinking because when Greg presented the blob wall, he basically seemed to confess that it was a failure because he didn't calculate all of the tolerances of the material of the blob wall versus the attempts to bring in. Just sort of went there and left it behind. In that case, of all bricks and tiles. So I'm wondering what is the performance that they have to sustain to actually call them tiles and not hoops or hard objects or whatever. I mean, like at what point do they how do they get tested? I guess as tiles.
Well, yeah, I mean, they would have to, you'd have to do a prototype outside, I guess, on a roof. I mean, to me, they don't seem that absurd as tiles because if you look at even conventional terracotta, half cylinder stuff, the Spanish roof stuff that's all in Los Angeles, for instance, smaller, the profiles are smaller, but they, these would be, it's kind of water channeling pieces that could be installed here. I mean, it's funny, Eric almost had the same reaction. He's like, well, this would be a model for the building, but it's not a tile. It's a tile.
Me and Eric are like this.
But, so, I mean, I agree, it was not, we made a decision at the outset, given that show in that gallery, that the odd thing of, as I said often, it's a prototype for someone to build a cantilever project or something. And we decided, okay, we're going to swerve, we will make the tiles 1-to-1, 3, they're pretty big items. The weight is an issue, I mean, it's something they're hollow, so that reduces it a little bit. Again, some of them were made in ceramic, so it was really, the beginning of it was very close to the conventional terracotta tile, just with a different form. You fold this in the round, and they would obviously be denser than we're showing them in the laid out on the floor. So really, you'd have a whole field of those on a roof, and it would start to produce odd, erratic. Instead of shedding water as it's supposed to do, the hope is that it would promote growth of vegetation. It might get a disaster. It would have to be prototype, I think.
It's just some kind of watershed. I think it's a really interesting trajectory. Just look at your historical examples in the 60s, which are art and technology or art and engineering. And we keep pushing closer together, will one get to architectural tropes? Or was that issue of inexact geometry being, it's necessarily within the domain of art? Like, is that, do we know yet? Yes.
Well, servo, I mean, it's always been, is this art or architecture? I think it's been the question that has constantly been sort of put forth with our work. In a way, I don't, those kind of labels, I don't personally find them that useful.
Well, I mean, I don't want to tread on someone else's territory here, but I mean, I would say, is it art or design? Because it's sort of like from the ceiling down, it's design, and the ground up, it's art. The question is like trying to get them closer, does that do something? In other words, are they other species? I mean, I guess I'm looking for the tropic quality of architecture, which would say these are the conventions of architecture, and looking to Smithson and Phillips Woodsheds, gets me a way out, or gets me a way out at the end of intricate geometry, let's say Scott Cohen, or Greg's failure with blob wall. Like trying to position it relative to the body of interest of your fellow travelers, or your adversaries, or your people who seem good, but we need to do something else. Like that kind of body of knowledge.
I mean, definitely, I undeniably, like Greg's work is a huge influence because I taught him for 3 years. Zurich, I was a student. And I think that whole discussion of the inexact, I mean, I was always provoked because at the same time, you know, I had previously been in the art department at Columbia doing an MFA, and there the whole discussion was this grousing a lot of formulas. And I thought it was funny that at the same time, you know, in architecture, you get like Rickman saying, okay, inexact is off the table. And now it's just peculiar, I think, that we see things that we might term as being inexact, glitch, messy. You know, there's a lot of work out there, both in architecture and other fields, design, art, which I think I think there has definitely been a shift away from that kind of formal discourse where it's all about this sort of exquisite geometry being translated into exquisite material form via a series of very high fidelity processes. And it seems like there are people that are looking at what happens when that act of translation gets kind of intervened with or sort of messed with. And that, I think, does have potentially an aesthetic fallout where, you know, we may find that rather than, you know, the kind of smooth, immaculate, supple surfaces that were once considered so desirable, that there are other kinds of formal logics that become desirable. But it's just something that's like in the air. Yeah.
What does precise and exact mean when you describe these kind of abstract, you know, use precise as a way not to describe how you produce them, right? But you always describe them as precise. So are they just representational of something else, and the precision is that they're so perfectly visible, these kind of non-visible informations, or like the, you know, the gray or the kind of black concrete floor installations, like those were described as precise forms. So what does that mean in the context of that?
Precise, well, I would say that the
Or
precision,
what would it mean for it to be imprecise then, I guess? Like if those
those are
precise,
actually imprecise, I would argue, because the mold is designed to be flexible so that no two are actually going to come out exactly the same, as opposed to some of the earlier work we did, like the first project class, Archologics, where we were kind of obsessed with getting this kind of, you know, a high quality registration, and producing this perfect object that matched the original digital file as closely as we could. Whereas these are actually intentionally looking for deviations, and that's the whole process of casting tends to promote that, which is why we're using it.
but I guess I mean like not the like that I kind of get, but you seem to in the lecture describe it in relationship to the forms, right? So not how they then got realized or anything, but that the forms themselves were precise, or that, you know, you're interested in exact shape, but the shapes are very like, you know, unique and esoteric. They're not kind of platonics or things like that. So what does precision mean to something that is not a representative object, and it also isn't based on any kind of platonic deviation? Like, how do you get precision for something that's idiosyncratic? What would that even mean?
It's a good question, because it loops back again to the whole thing of what is an exact, you know, I mean, this teardrop shape is really a combination of a sphere and a kind of conic, but it's slightly, it's not literally, I don't know how to explain it, but, so it's not about platonic geometry. I think it's just about taking, it could be almost any form as the starting point, like the water bottle, but saying, okay, in the act of translation, how does, you know, the understanding of this as something precise become transformed?
I forgot that there's drinks upstairs. Could you restrain so we can ask a question of the drinks?